Baek Seung-ho ruled the city with a heart of stone, until a single photo of his daughter's tears turned his empire into a cage. In the underworld, Seung-ho was known as the calculated king, a man who had eliminated every human emotion to maintain absolute control. But even the most powerful man has a price he is unwilling to pay. For Seung-ho, that price was his daughter, Yerin, the only piece of his soul he hadn't sold for power. That evening, Seung-ho sat in his 50th floor office, a sanctuary of polished mahogany, bulletproof glass, and absolute silence. Through the window, the city lights shimmered like jewels he already owned. He was a man used to giving orders, not receiving them. He believed he was untouchable until his phone vibrated on the sleek desk. It wasn't a business deal, and it wasn't a warning from his lieutenants. It was an image from an unknown number. In the cold blue light of the screen, his world shattered. There was Yerin. She wasn't in the safe, gated world he had built for her. She was seated on the floor of a dim industrial hallway, her hands bound behind her back. She looked frightened, but her eyes were alert, staring into the camera with a defiance that matched his own. Behind her stood shadows, figures that didn't look like common thugs. They were cold, organized, and professional. In that heartbeat, the calculated king felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Raw, paralyzing fear. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone, realizing that his high-rise fortress was now a prison. Stay with me until the end, because what the most powerful man in Korea does next to save his daughter will shock his enemies and destroy everything you think you know about the price of power. The 50th floor of the Baek International Building was more than an office. It was a sanctuary of absolute silence and polished steel. From this height, the sprawling neon landscape of Seoul didn't look like a city of 10 million souls. It looked like a map of jewels that Baek Seung-ho had already conquered. He sat rigidly in a hand-stitched leather chair, his posture as unyielding as the bulletproof glass that encased him. At 45, Seung-ho was the calculated king, a man who had traded the messy volatility of human emotion for the cold, predictable precision of a grandmaster. His world was one of immaculate order. Every business deal, every territory dispute, and every whispered threat in the back alleys of Gangnam was filtered through his logic before it was executed. To the public, he was a legitimate titan of industry. To the underworld, he was the ghost in the machine. He ruled not through loud displays of violence, but through the terrifying weight of his stillness. His tailored black suit was devoid of a single crease, mirroring a life where chaos was simply a variable to be eliminated. Within this fortress of glass and mahogany, Seung-ho had built a second, even more impenetrable sanctuary for his daughter, Yerin. To him, Yerin was the only part of his life that remained untainted by the blood and grime of his rise to power. She was his white space, a world of gated universities and art galleries, kept purposely blind to the shadows her father cast. He viewed her safety as a mathematical certainty. As long as he controlled the city, no harm could ever cross the threshold of her world. He picked up a crystal tumbler of water, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, lonely sound that echoed off the minimalist walls. His life was a masterpiece of isolation. He had no friends, only assets. No enemies, only obstacles. He preferred it this way. In the silence of the 50th floor, he felt like a god looking down at a world he had finally tamed. But even a god must occasionally look at the tools of his trade. His phone sat on the sleek mahogany desk, its screen dark and unassuming. It was the only tether he had to the world below, a direct line to his lieutenants and the vast machinery of his empire. For 20 years, that phone had brought him nothing but progress reports and profit margins. Seung-ho reached out, his hand steady, intending to check the closing markets. He expected the usual, order, growth, and the quiet hum of a city under his thumb. He didn't know that in the next heartbeat, the glass fortress he had built around his life was about to shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. The silence of the office, usually a sign of Seung-ho's total control, suddenly felt like a held breath. He reached for the smartphone, his movements habitual and confident. The ping was a single sharp note that cut through the room's expensive stillness. It wasn't a sound he recognized. It was a priority alert from an encrypted, unknown source. He tapped the screen. The blue light reflected in his dark eyes, casting a cold, ghostly pallor over his features. The image loaded with agonizing slowness. It was a high-resolution shot, far too professional for a common street kidnapping. In the center of the frame was Yerin. She was seated on a grimy concrete floor in a dim industrial hallway, the stark yellow light from above casting long, distorted shadows. Her hands were pulled behind her, her shoulders hunched in a way that signaled a desperate attempt to stay small. But it was her face that stopped his heart. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the lens, shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. Behind her, out of focus but unmistakable, stood the figures of iron silence, faces obscured, posture relaxed but predatory. The crystal tumbler in Seung-ho's other hand trembled. A hairline fracture of water spilled over the rim, soaking into the pristine mahogany desk. For a man who had survived assassinations and high-stakes betrayals, the sensation was foreign. It was a cold, creeping numbness that started in his fingertips and raced toward his chest. His breathing, usually a rhythmic, unnoticeable function, became shallow and jagged. The transition was instantaneous. The boss died in that office, replaced by a man who could feel the walls of his empire closing in. The silence was no longer his ally. It was a weight. Every polished surface of his sanctuary mocked him. The calculated king looked at the variables again, but the math no longer added up. There was no logic that could protect a daughter already in the hands of ghosts. He stood up so abruptly his chair skidded across the hardwood, the sound like a scream in the quiet room. His face was a mask of restrained panic, brows furrowed, jaw locked in a futile attempt to keep his composure from shattering. He looked at his hands and realized, for the first time in his life, they were shaking. A text box appeared below the image. Iron Silence has a debt to collect. Walk out alone. No guards. No armor. Or the silence becomes permanent. Seung-ho turned away from the panoramic view of his city. The neon lights now looked like nothing more than cold, distant sparks. The office was a cage. The order was gone. The chaos had arrived, and for the first time in 20 years, the most powerful man in the city had no idea what to do. The adrenaline of panic was quickly replaced by a cold, desperate need for action. Seung-ho moved from his desk to the hidden terminal recessed into the mahogany wall, the oracle of his organization. This was the nerve center of his empire, a machine capable of tracking a single grain of rice across the city. His fingers, usually steady as a surgeon's, flew across the keys with a frantic, blurring precision. He initiated a level 6 deep search, whispering the name like a curse. Iron Silence. He expected the usual data cascade, bank accounts, encrypted messages, or past criminal associations. Instead, the screen remained a void of scrolling black. He pushed the system harder, bypassing government firewalls and tapping into the city's private surveillance networks. He ran a facial recognition scan on the shadowy figures in the background of Yerin's photo, waiting for the red match found notification that always came. The software chugged, cycling through millions of records in seconds, but the result was a devastating null. The men behind his daughter were ghosts. Seung-ho's brow furrowed, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. He attempted to trace the origin of the Ransom photo, hoping to pin a GPS coordinate to the industrial hallway. The signal was a hall of mirrors. It bounced from Seoul to Zurich, then to a dark server in the Caymans, before vanishing into a black hole of military-grade encryption. Every digital trail he touched turned to ash the moment he reached for it. It wasn't just that they were hidden. They had been professionally erased. The digital footprint of the city he once owned had been bleached white. The calculated king stared at the no results found message blinking in the center of his vision. It was a rhythmic, mocking pulse. In that moment, the weight of his mahogany desk and the height of his glass tower felt meaningless. His power was built on information, on knowing everyone's secrets, every man's price, and every rival's location. But Iron Silence was a vacuum. They were a ghost alias he had never heard of, operating in a world that didn't exist on his maps. He realized with a sickening jolt that this wasn't the work of a rival gang or a foreign cartel. This level of deletion required intimate knowledge of his own protocols. They knew how he searched, so they knew exactly how to stay invisible. As the glowing screen reflected in his eyes, Seung-ho felt the first true crack in his foundation. He wasn't just losing his daughter. He was losing the very eyes he used to rule his kingdom. He was blind, and for the first time in 20 years, the most powerful man in Korea was truly alone in the dark. The silence was shattered not by a text, but by the jarring old-fashioned ring of a burner phone hidden inside a drawer he rarely opened. Seung-ho's hand hovered over the wood for a second before he pulled it out. The screen didn't show a name, only a string of zeros. He answered, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that usually made men's blood run cold. "Where is she?" The voice on the other end was distorted, a digital rasp that sounded like metal grinding on metal. "The time for questions ended the moment we took her, Seung-ho. Now, you listen. If a single one of your black-suited dogs follows you, we send her back in pieces." Seung-ho's jaw tightened so hard he felt a phantom pain in his teeth. "You want the money. Name the place." "We want you," the voice corrected, cold and deliberate. "Leave your building through the service exit. No guards. No sirens. In the basement level P4, row J, you'll find a silver sedan. The keys are under the wheel well. Drive to the old industrial district. You have 20 minutes before the next photo arrives. If you're late, she loses a finger. If you're followed, she loses everything." The line went dead. Seung-ho stared at the black screen, the reflection of his own pale face staring back. To leave without his detail was to commit suicide. He had enemies on every corner who would kill for a glimpse of him without his wall of muscle. But the image of Yerin on the concrete floor was a weight he couldn't lift. He walked to the heavy office doors. His head of security, a man named Park who had been with him for a decade, stood at attention the moment the doors opened. "Boss, the cars are ready." Seung-ho looked at Park, a man who represented the very security he was about to discard. For a moment, he wanted to tell him everything. But the calculated king knew the rules of this new game. He couldn't trust the system he had built because the system was exactly what Iron Silence was targeting. "Stand down," Seung-ho said, his voice flat. "I'm going out alone. Private business." "Alone? Sir, that's against every protocol." "The protocol is what I say it is," Seung-ho snapped, the flash of his old authority returning for a brief, flickering second. "Stay here. If anyone follows me, you're dead before I am." He didn't wait for an answer. He descended in the service elevator, the chrome walls reflecting a man who was slowly being stripped of his title. In the dim, oil-stained shadows of the P4 garage, the silver sedan sat like a metallic tomb. It was a cheap, 10-year-old model with rusted fenders. As he slid into the fabric seat, the smell of stale tobacco and old air filled his lungs. He reached and a cracked windshield, a far cry from the armored limousines he usually inhabited under the wheel well, his fingers grazing the cold metal of the key. As the engine sputtered to life with a pathetic wheezing roar, Seung-ho realized he was no longer a king. He was just a father in a borrowed car, driving into a trap he had spent a lifetime building. The city's neon glow was a dying ember in the rearview mirror as the silver sedan rattled toward the jagged skyline of the old industrial district. Here, the streetlights were rhythmic blinkers of orange decay, and the air tasted of salt and rusted iron. The burner phone chirped, a sharp, digital demand that vibrated against the plastic dashboard. "Stop the car," the voice rasped, stripped of even its previous mechanical warmth. "There is a dumpster under the rusted water tower. Shed the skin, Seung-ho. No silk. No steel. If you walk into our house wearing the boss's armor, you walk in alone. If you want the girl, come as the man who failed her." Seung-ho pulled the sedan to the curb, the tires crunching over shattered glass. The engine died with a pathetic shudder, leaving him in a silence far more terrifying than the noise of the city. He stepped out into the biting wind, the cold air immediately clawing at his throat. He looked at the dumpster, a blackened maw in the shadows of the water tower. He began the ritual of dispossession. First, he reached under his left arm, unholstering the custom Kimber .45, a weapon that had been his silent companion for a decade. He felt its weight, the cold familiarity of the grip, and then dropped it into the trash. The heavy thud echoed like a closing tomb. Next came the backup blade hidden at the small of his back, and the ceramic pistol tucked into his ankle holster. One by one, the tools of his lethality disappeared into the refuse. Then his hands went to the buttons of his suit jacket. This was the true armor. The heavy black silk, hand-stitched in Milan, was more than clothing. It was a psychological shield that signaled his rank to every man in the city. When he wore it, he was the calculated king. When he wore it, he was untouchable. He slid the jacket off his shoulders. As the fabric fell away, the wind sliced through his thin white dress shirt, making him shiver. He laid the jacket across the passenger seat of the sedan. It sat there, empty and hollow, like the discarded skin of a predator that had finally been cornered. Standing in the shadow of the water tower, Seung-ho felt a raw, agonizing vulnerability. For 20 years, he had never been without a weapon or the symbols of his status. Now, he was just a middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt, his chest exposed, his pulse visible in the hollow of his throat. He felt naked, stripped of the persona that had kept the world at bay. He climbed back into the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. They were cold, pale, and entirely human. He realized then that Iron Silence didn't just want to kill him, they wanted to unmake him. They wanted to see if there was anything left of Baek Seung-ho once the boss was gone. He put the car in gear and drove deeper into the darkness, no longer a king, but a father with nothing left to lose but his life. The silver sedan's engine died with a final wheezing rattle in front of a massive, derelict textile factory. The building was a hollowed-out skull of rusted iron and broken glass, silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. Seung-ho stepped out, his white shirt a stark, vulnerable target against the encroaching gloom. He followed the instructions from the latest text, a single GPS pin that led him to a heavy steel door at the rear of the complex. The door was slightly ajar, a silent invitation that felt more like a trap. As he pushed it open, the groan of metal on metal echoed through the cavernous interior. He stepped into a long, narrow hallway, and his breath hitched. This was it. The dim, flickering yellow light overhead, the oil-stained concrete floor, the exposed copper pipes sweating with condensation. It was the exact scene from the photo. The air inside was freezing and held a heavy metallic tang. It wasn't the chaotic, frantic energy of a street gang's hideout. There were no discarded cigarette butts, no muffled laughter, no smell of cheap beer. Instead, there was a cold, clinical precision to the silence. It was the iron silence he had been promised, a professional atmosphere that mirrored the very operations he used to run. Every shadow seemed deliberate. As he walked deeper into the labyrinth, his footsteps sounded like gunshots against the concrete. He felt the absence of his jacket like a missing limb. Without the weighted silk, he felt thin and transparent. His eyes, trained for decades to spot an ambush, darted toward the darkened doorways lining the hall. He knew they were there. He could feel the weight of their gaze, a cold pressure against his skin. These weren't amateurs looking for a quick score. They were organized. They moved with a rhythmic, military-grade patience. The hallway seemed to stretch, the yellow light becoming a blur as his calculated king persona tried to map the exits, only to realize he was being channeled toward a single point of no return. He stopped in the center of the hall, the silence pressing against his eardrums. "I'm here," he said, his voice stripped of its usual boom, sounding small and human in the vast industrial gut of the building. He wasn't met with a shout or a threat. Instead, a door at the far end of the hallway swung open, spilling a clinical white light across the floor. A single, shadowy figure stepped into the light, their body language relaxed but lethal. Seung-ho's heart hammered against his ribs, not with the thrill of the hunt, but with the terrifying realization that he had finally walked into the heart of a machine he himself had helped design. The man who stepped into the clinical white light did not look like a monster. He looked like a memory Seung-ho had tried to delete. He was middle-aged, his face etched with the kind of weariness that comes from decades of living in the shadows, and his left hand was missing 2 fingers, a wound Seung-ho vaguely remembered signing a compensation check for years ago. You still don't recognize me, do you, boss? The man asked. His voice was no longer distorted by a modulator. It was a rough, human barrette that vibrated with a lifetime of resentment. Seung-ho searched the archives of his mind, the calculated king, trying to find a name for the face. Hon, he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You were my driver. 6 years. 7, Hon corrected, stepping closer. From the darkened doorways along the hall, 3 more men emerged. They didn't wear masks. They didn't need to. Seung-ho saw them now, really saw them, for the first time. There was Choi, the silent enforcer who had taken a bullet for Seung-ho in a Busan dockyard. There was Lim, the technician who had built the very encryption protocols Seung-ho had tried to use to find them. These weren't rivals. They were the discarded gears of his own machine. We were the iron silence you created, Hon said, his eyes hard as flint. We did the work no one else would touch. We bled for the Empire while you sat on the 50th floor, calculating our value like we were entries on a spreadsheet. And when we were no longer efficient, you didn't even fire us face to face. You sent a memo. You erased us. Seung-ho looked from one face to the next, a sickening hollow opening in his chest. To him, these men had been invisible, tools that functioned until they broke, at which point they were replaced. He had never looked in the rearview mirror to acknowledge the man driving him. He had never asked about the families of the men who stood guard while he slept. His calculated coldness had been his greatest strength, but here in the freezing gut of a dead factory, it was his greatest sin. You thought power was built on mahogany and glass, Choi said, his voice a low growl. But power is built on the men who stand in the dark for you. You forgot us, Seung-ho. So we decided to remind you what happens when the shadows decide to speak. The weight of their collective gaze was suffocating. Seung-ho stood before them, stripped of his jacket and his weapons, realizing that he wasn't facing a gang. He was facing his own reflection. He had built his world on the silence of these men, and now, that silence was over. He looked toward the door at the end of the hall, his voice trembling. Where is my daughter? She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this, Hon replied, a cruel smile touching his lips. She's the only thing you have left that hasn't been calculated yet. The door at the end of the hallway groaned open, revealing a room that smelled of ozone and damp earth. In the center, bathed in the harsh, flickering glow of a single industrial worklight, sat Yerin. She was zip-tied to a heavy metal chair, her face tear-stained but her jaw set in a desperate, trembling line. Seeing her there, the only pure thing in his world surrounded by the rot of his past, caused a physical ache in Seung-ho's chest that no bullet could replicate. Yerin, he breathed, stepping forward, but the cold click of a hammer being pulled back on a handgun stopped him dead. Hon stood behind her, his missing fingers a jagged silhouette against her shoulder. Stop right there, boss, Hon said. We're not interested in your offshore accounts. We don't want the gold bars you keep under your floorboards. That money is just paper soaked in our sweat. We want the one thing you've spent 20 years hiding. Seung-ho's hands were open and empty at his sides. Whatever you want. Just let her go. Then say it, Hon commanded, leaning down to Yerin's ear while his eyes remained fixed on Seung-ho. Tell her, and tell us, exactly what happened in the winter of 2018 at the Incheon docks. Tell her about the men you left in that shipping container because the insurance payout was worth more than their lives. Tell her how you calculated the cost of our silence. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out. Seung-ho looked at Yerin. She was staring at him, her alert eyes wide with a dawning horror. This was his white space, the daughter who believed he was a titan of industry, a protector, a hero. To save her life, he had to destroy the image she had of him. He had to tear down the last sanctuary he had left. I did it, Seung-ho whispered, his voice sounding thin and hollow. Louder, Choi growled from the shadows. The microphone is recording, and your daughter needs to hear her father's true voice. Seung-ho took a shuddering breath, his calculated king persona finally dissolving into ash. I knew the container was being seized. I knew you were inside. I didn't call the port authority because it would have tied me to the shipment. I let you go to prison. I let you be erased, because the math said it was the most efficient path to the top. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any stone. Yerin let out a small, broken sob, her head dropping as if her neck could no longer support the weight of the truth. Seung-ho felt his soul fracture. He had paid the ransom. He had given them his pride, his reputation, and his daughter's love. He stood there, a stripped and broken man, waiting to see if the price of his sins was enough to buy her freedom. Han's eyes were glassy with a dark, triumphant joy. He had dismantled the king's throne, stone by stone, in front of the only person the king loved. The truth doesn't set you free, Seung-ho, Han rasped, the handgun trembling in his grip as he aimed it squarely at Yerin's forehead. It just makes the ending more honest. You destroyed our lives to protect your empire. Now, I destroy your empire to end your life. Seung-ho didn't look at the gun. He didn't look at the shadowy figures of the men he had betrayed. He looked only at Yerin. The calculated king finally saw the one variable he had ignored for 20 years. His own life was the only currency left to spend. In a sudden violent burst of movement that defied his age and his exhaustion, Seung-ho didn't dive for the weapon. He didn't try to strike Han. He lunged across the freezing concrete, his body a blur of white fabric, and threw himself directly into the path of the barrel. The gunshot was a thunderclap that shattered the industrial stillness. The bullet tore into Seung-ho's shoulder, the force spinning him around, but he didn't collapse. He used the momentum of his falling body to crash into the metal chair, knocking Yerin to the ground and shielding her with his own torso. He felt the hot, searing bloom of pain, but it was distant, a secondary hum compared to the weight of his daughter beneath him. Now! Seung-ho screamed, not at the kidnappers, but at the ghosts. He had known Han's ego would require witnesses. He had counted on the fact that even in their hatred, these men still valued the code of the soldier. As Seung-ho lay there, his blood soaking into the cold floor, he looked up at Choi, the man who had once taken a bullet for him in Busan. You wanted a leader who saw you, Seung-ho gasped, his voice bubbling with a wet, ragged edge. I'm not a leader. I'm just a father. Finish me. But let the girl walk. That's the only deal left. The room froze. Han stood over them, his face contorted with a frantic need to fire again, but Choi's massive hand suddenly clamped down on the slide of Han's pistol. The enforcer's face was unreadable, but he didn't look at Han. He looked down at the man on the floor who had finally, for once in his life, stopped calculating the cost and decided to pay it in full. The iron silence had been broken, replaced by the heavy, labored breathing of a man willing to die to be more than a boss. The tension in the room didn't snap. It dissolved into a heavy, suffocating grief. Choi's grip on Han's gun remained immovable, a silent judgment passed by the men Seung-ho had once ignored. For a long minute, the only sound was the wet, ragged hitch of Seung-ho's breath and Yerin's muffled sobs. Finally, Choi looked away from Han and toward the other men. With a slow, deliberate nod, he pulled a combat knife and sliced through Yerin's restraints. She collapsed into her father's arms, her warmth a jarring contrast to the cold, oil-slicked concrete. Seung-ho pulled her close with his good arm, his blood staining her blouse, a crimson signature of his final deal. He didn't look at Han, who had slumped against the wall, the fire of his vengeance extinguished by the sheer weight of Seung-ho's sacrifice. There was no boss left to kill. The man on the floor was someone Han didn't recognize. Seung-ho stood up, his legs shaking, leaning heavily on Yerin. He didn't reach for the burner phone. He didn't look back at the shadows of the men who had been his iron silence. He walked toward the exit, each step a painful distance away from the life he had spent 20 years perfecting. As they passed through the long, yellow-lit hallway, he saw his reflection in a shattered piece of industrial glass. He looked pale, broken, and older than he ever had in his high-rise sanctuary. But for the first time, his eyes weren't calculating. They emerged into the cool, grey mist of dawn. The silver sedan sat waiting, a rusted relic of the night that had unmade him. Seung-ho reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys to the Beck International building, his encrypted security fobs, and the heavy gold signet ring that bore his family's criminal crest. He let them fall into the gutter, the metallic clatter swallowed by the waking city. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the jagged skyline into a silhouette of ash and gold. The 50th floor was still up there, a fortress of glass and mahogany, but it belonged to a ghost. Seung-ho slid into the driver's seat, his daughter safe beside him. He didn't look at the rearview mirror to see if he was being followed. He didn't care. The calculated king had lost his empire, and as he drove Yerin toward the light, he realized he had never felt more powerful. He wasn't a boss, and he wasn't a god. He was just a father, and he was finally home.